Great. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. This is a webinar that we have planned as part of kind of the inaugural couple of these. There was one a couple of days ago that I hope you all were able to attend. I think it was really wonderful. And if you weren't able to, I think it will be available on to kind of rewatch. And I definitely recommend that you do that. This one is really a look at the Apostle Paul, and it's an attempt to kind of reclaim Paul as a person who can be an ally for progressive Christians on questions of misogyny and homophobia. I'm sort of assuming here that you all are with me on thinking that misogyny and homophobia are bad, and that it wouldn't be bad to have scriptural allies in this case. And usually Paul has been presumed to be an enemy on this, and so my goal here is to kind of turn him into an ally. So I'm going to go to this second slide here, which is going to kind of talk about what I want to do. The first thing on the agenda is to talk about why progressive Christians so often hate Paul. I'll talk more about this in just a second. The second thing is to find out how we can stop blaming Paul as a source of Christianity's problems. I think, as a scholar of Paul, I think this is kind of an unfair characterization. But really the main thing I want to do is to talk about how we can think about Paul as an ally. Not just get Paul off the hook, but actually think about Paul as someone who can help us as we kind of put forward values of justice and inclusion. So I want to kind of start by, here we go, make the slide advance. Start by saying that this work for me comes out of the confluence of two different parts of my life. One part of my life is represented by this picture on the right. That's a picture of my congregation in suburban Denver, First Plymouth Congregational Church. Yes, as Katie is typing in, if you want to ask questions, you can answer those in the lower left, or you can type into the chat bar and I'll see those there as well. So I've spent about 15 years and counting now in progressive Christian congregations, and I've been teaching and preaching in those congregations, and I've discovered that almost every progressive Christian person that I meet hates Paul. Everyone hates Paul. And the same thing is true in the seminary Introduction to the New Testament classes that I teach at the Isle of School of Theology, which is where I'm coming to you from right now. My experience in those kind of classes is that all of my students, who are generally progressive Christian folks, although not all of them are, almost all of my students hate Paul too. People have lots and lots of different reasons to hate Paul, but they very frequently do hate Paul. The other part that goes into this is represented in that picture on the left, which is an 11th century mosaic of Paul. And that is that I have been studying Paul as a scholar now for about 10 years and have been researching and reading a lot about Paul. And what I've discovered is that a lot of the really modern biblical scholarship is saying stuff that that kind of mitigates a lot of the reasons that people hate Paul. So these two things are coming together. I'm meeting all these people who hate Paul, and I'm reading all the scholarship that says, Paul is maybe unfairly blamed for some of this, and those are coming together for me as a way to they're coming together in a way that helps me to give a presentation like this. So I want to move to the next slide, which is to, I'll skip that one, and ask you all why you hate Paul. So this is a good opportunity to use that questions box there at the bottom, or to type into the chat bar, to talk about some reasons you might hate Paul. And I'll kind of come back to some of those as we go along. Seems like lots of folks have lots and lots of different reasons. Jennifer doesn't hate Paul. Some of you don't hate Paul, and good, I'm glad. I did for a long time, actually. This is part of where this comes from for me, is that for a long time I thought, oh, Paul, he's the worst part of the New Testament. I'm never going to do anything with Paul because of lots and lots of reasons. So Robin is bringing up one of the really important ones, which is that Paul is credited with this line that women should be silent in churches. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. As some of those folks are still typing, I want to go through some of the reasons I've heard. This slide, this is a picture of, it's a Caravaggio painting of Paul's so-called conversion. This conversion of Paul on the road to Damascus, it's kind of a famous story, is the origin of Paul's supposed anti-Semitism. So a lot of folks don't like Paul because he is anti-Semitic. And so the story goes, well, Paul on the road to Damascus converts from Judaism to Christianity and becomes sort of a persecutor of Judaism, where before he'd been a persecutor of Christianity. This is a narrative that really has been completely destabilized by modern biblical scholarship. It's something that comes out largely of the Reformation, Lutheran theology, and something called the New Perspective on Paul has really eroded this Paul as anti-Semite thing. Paul actually emerges as one of the proudest Jews of antiquity if you read his writing in light of modern scholarship. Another of these reasons I sometimes hear is that he is a prude, that Paul is someone who thinks sex is bad and that bodies are dirty and that we should resist them, that we should try to subvert our bodily urges. I've shown you here a little passage from 1 Corinthians 7, which you might not be able to make out, but here he's basically saying, look, it's better if you are celibate. Time is short. Paul thinks the return of Jesus is coming any time now, so he thinks time is short. So prudishness is one of the reasons. If you've ever been exposed to Christian purity culture, a lot of times that is something that that Paul gets implicated in. Corey, we'll talk about that translation in just a minute. That's a troublesome and bad translation, in my opinion. One very common reason to hate Paul is that he appears at several places to have a pro-slavery stance. I think this is actually exactly wrong. I don't think Paul is pro-slavery at all. But there are places like in Ephesians 6:5, as you see here, where Paul appears to be defending slavery. We'll say more about Ephesians and why that's not a good reason to hate Paul in a few minutes. A very recent one that has come up is Paul as an anti-immigrant person. This is, in my mind, kind of an absurd charge against Paul, actually. I think this is not a good reading of Paul at all, but it really came to the forefront over the summer with the Attorney General citing Romans 13 as kind of justification for the family separation at the border policy. And perhaps one of the real big ones for a lot of folks, so maybe some of you like me grew up in more evangelical settings, is this theology based on guilt and shame, this sense that we have this unpayable debt that we owe to God, and Paul's the one who really articulates this. And so a lot of people point to Paul as the source of just some really hurtful, harmful theology. So all of those are reasons that people have told me that they hate Paul. And if you want to know more about those, we might make this into a short course that would come up maybe later in the year or early next year. So if you're interested in some of those, stay tuned for that, or let Katie know if that's something that's interesting to you. I also have a book coming out on this from Chalice Press in 2019 that will go over a lot of this as well. So, be thinking about that. But today I really want to focus on two of the really major reasons that people tell me about hating Paul, which are homophobia and misogyny. So for the rest of the time, I want to focus on those two in particular and how we can really think about Paul differently with regard to these questions. So my agenda for these for the rest of our time is really to talk about how and why the church has gotten Paul wrong, and to give you some tools from modern biblical scholarship to help claim Paul as an ally, to actually do kind of a 180-degree turn with Paul, not just to kind of get him off the hook, but to really claim him as an ally for progressive Christian values. And I want to start with homophobia, partly because this is really, the question of human sexuality is really one of the major questions that many faith communities are struggling with today. So the school I'm sitting in right now, I don't know if you can still see my face or not, but like in a little icon at the bottom, but I'm sitting at the Isle of School of Theology, which is one of the 13 United Methodist seminaries. And the United Methodist Church is absolutely torn apart over this question right now. Other denominations have been in the past as well, as you all know. So I want to start with the question of homophobia, because Paul often gets leveraged in those kinds of conversations as evidence for people who say that the Bible says homosexuality is wrong and we should get rid of it in our congregations. I think that's really completely untrue and unfair to Paul. So in thinking about Paul as and Paul's perspectives on human sexuality, the first really important thing to know about Paul is that Paul lived in a different world than we live in. Paul lived in antiquity. He lived in the ancient world. He does not live in the year 2018 in North America or anywhere else. And Paul, therefore, kind of walks around with a different set of categories in his head than we do. This might seem kind of obvious, but it's really the first principle for thinking about what Paul says, because we cannot ever assume that Paul lives, with the same kind of structures of the world that we do. We can't assume that he knows anything about the world that we live in, and that he has this access to the same kinds of information that we have access to. So, for example, I talk about this in the book that's coming out next year, which is, my first congregation, I met these two women who were coming to terms with the fact that they were in love with each other. They were coming to terms with their own sexuality and what that meant for them. It's been 15 years since I met them. Now they are married to each other. They have children together. They have a mortgage together, right? They're indistinguishable in every way from my own marriage with my wife and my family, except they're two women instead of a man and a woman. They're sort of, there's no distinction. For Paul, living in Paul's time and place, that would have been completely unthinkable. He simply did not have the category to think about a situation like that. So we all have access to information that Paul didn't have. We understand that there are people in relationships who are committed to each other, these relationships are mutually beneficial, mutually consensual. Paul thought none of that was possible. He simply didn't have the categories. Paul was often, when he was writing about this kind of stuff, thinking about relationships that were exploitative, that were not consensual, that were idolatrous, right? Paul was simply working with different categories. Another kind of categorical thing is in this next slide, which is that Paul thought that sex was for procreation, that sex was, the purpose of it was to make babies. And a lot of people still think that today, to be fair, although I don't know how many people really think that today. This is a perspective that Paul had that was rooted in his Jewish identity. To say that is not then an invitation to anti-Semitism or to anti-Judaism, but it's simply saying that he was a product of his own time and place, and he was grounded in his tradition. And part of being grounded in that tradition was that he had certain understandings of human sexuality. So when he thinks about sexuality, he thinks that sex is to make babies. Now, all of us, again, we're living in a different world than Paul. All of us have an understanding of sexuality, that we know that people have sex for lots of reasons that don't have anything to do with procreation, right? There's people who can't or don't want children, who use birth control. There are kinds of sex that don't produce, that can't produce babies, right? So we kind of understand, that that's not always what it's about. There's a lot more to it than that. But Paul usually objected to kinds of sex that were non-procreative. You can see this in one of the so-called clobber texts. The clobber texts are the ones that are usually aimed at people who are LGBTQIA, people who are on the wrong side of this issue from the church's perspective. Usually they have these passages thrown at them from Leviticus, but one of the ones that gets thrown at folks is this one from Romans 1, where Paul talks about passions. And I can't tell if everyone's still here. That's kind of why I'm stumbling. I haven't seen anyone chime in a while, so I want to make sure that you all can, yeah, good. You just got to say an amen every now and then again, right? And that way I'll know you're here. There you go. Thank you, Jose. So with the passion thing, passion doesn't mean really what we think of it as meaning. Passion for Paul means that he thinks these Gentile folks were overcome with this passion that they couldn't control, that when they were given over to passion, as it says here in Romans 1, that God was sort of abandoning these people to do what they wanted to do anyway, what was really in their hearts. This is kind of, the logic. You can kind of see this logic at play between sex for procreation and sex using birth control, right? So Paul might well have objected to birth control because he would say, well, that's just giving into to passion. You have to have a purpose to your sex. So we can kind of see his logic, but we don't share his premises and we don't share his conclusions, right? We don't reach the same point that he does. So I think even in something, right, Jennifer, thank you very much. Women in this scenario aren't, or really no one's supposed to enjoy it, but certainly women are not supposed to enjoy it. We simply don't share Paul's predispositions on this. So I don't think we have to reach his conclusions if we don't share his premises. But the other thing to say about this is that the clobber texts from Paul are more complicated than they appear to be are on the surface. And here's where we get back to that translation issue that someone mentioned earlier. There are a few problems at work here, which is that one of them is that there's really no equivalency between the kind of terms we use for things and the terms Paul used. This is always a problem in translation. Translation is always kind of an approximation that people do. It's never one-to-one. There's no word in one language that exactly corresponds to a word in another language. But this is especially troublesome in translating some of these passages from Paul, and I'll show you what I mean by that. In 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 10, I'll show you this verse in just a second. There are a couple of words in there that are really kind of difficult to translate, or maybe they're not difficult to translate, they've just been translated in bad ways. Maybe that's a better way to put it. One of these words is arsenokoitai, and the other is malakoi. I'll show you how these work in the verse in just a second. But arsenokoitai is kind of yes, thank you, Robin. That's exactly right. So malakoi is really weaponized. Both of these words are really weaponized and used against people in ways that are completely unwarranted, in my opinion, based on Paul's writing and based on the Greek and stuff like that. Arsenokoitai is actually a compound word. It's made from the words man and bed, and so it doesn't mean anything in particular. In fact, Katie might be able to tell me better. I think this is what scholars call a hapax legomena, which means it doesn't appear anywhere else in Greek literature. Maybe Paul invented the word, or else it's very, very rare. So it's hard when you have a word like that to know what it really means, because there's nothing to compare it to. That's how translation works. You have to find out what other people mean by a word and use it that way. So with this word arsenokoitai, it's a rare word, and so we don't quite know what it means, but it comes from words man and bed. So people have gone to speculation. So this next slide, here's how it's translated in the New Revised Standard Version. Usually I say the NRSV is pretty great. In this case, I don't think it's very good at all. So you can see here in the middle, you have male prostitutes and you have sodomites. Sodomites is sort of an extravagantly terrible translation here, because it relies on this definition of sodomy, which is already not a great definition, because sodomy's, a thing that's a legal category. It's also sort of a religious slander that people use. It relies on the story from Genesis, which is really more about hospitality than it is about sexuality. And it's about sexual violence, which none of us would condone. So it's a thank you, Jose. It's a really, really bad translation, but I'll kind of show you how this translation was arrived at. So this word gets translated, arsenokoitai gets translated different ways by different translations. Here it's sodomites. Others translate it those practicing homosexuality. One translation says men who practice homosexuality, people who have intercourse with the same sex, those that defile themselves with mankind, homosexuals, sexual perverts is what the Good News says. So you can see here the biases of the translators coming through pretty strongly, because no one knows what this word really means. And so you just kind of fill it up with whatever prejudice you already have in your head about things, and you make it mean that. The same is really true for malakoi. You see different translations. The King James says effeminate. One translation says passive homosexual partners. So sometimes it gets tied to a particular role in a sexual relationship. And often these two words get understood together. So arsenokoitais and malakoi are understood together as the two roles in the relationship between two men. And so that's kind of what, you can't really see that in this translation that's on your screen right now, but there are some who do kind of read it that way. The word malakos, by the way, or malakoi, the plural, is a Greek word that means soft. And it kind of sometimes takes on a secondary meaning having to do with being the receiving partner in a relationship, often alarmingly a relationship between a man and a boy. And so you can kind of see maybe why Paul would include it. Maybe he thought that that's what was happening, that he thought that's what the word meant. And so he included it as sort of a warning against abuse, not as a warning about two kind of adults in a consensual relationship. But the other thing to kind of, so to wrap that section up, the translation here is really difficult, and I think no modern translations do it very well at all. But it certainly doesn't mean anything like what people often confidently claim it means, which is that it's a condemnation of homosexuality. That's not true at all. You really can't get there, I don't think, with any kind of honest reading of the text. The other thing, though, to notice, and I hope you'll see this on this slide that we're on right now, I'll show you another one in a second, is that these words in Pauline literature appear in vice lists. This is something Paul did. I said earlier, Paul's a Jewish person, and he has all the kind of stereotypes and prejudices of a Jewish person. And so often he'll kind of rattle off these lists of things that he thinks are bad, that people should not do. And here you can kind of see how that goes. Fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, these two words we just looked at, thieves, greedy people, drunkards, revilers, robbers. He rattles off these lists as kind of stereotypical Gentile behaviors. You can kind of hear his frustration, like, oh, you Gentiles, you just can't get it together. You need to be more Jewish law following, basically, is what he's saying. Not that he thinks, actually, I should clarify, he doesn't think Gentiles need to follow the Jewish law. Sure, from Leviticus or from other places, he doesn't think they need to follow the Jewish law in order to be Jews, but he does think that the Jewish law is a nice guide to morality. And he thinks, like a lot of Jews did in antiquity, that Gentiles are just, they can't behave themselves. So that's what he's doing. And it's worth pointing out that these two words here in this text are embedded in stuff that probably everyone in this webinar right now has done, right? So I don't think you can see it, but I just bought last week my brand new shiny iPhone XS Max, right? It's like a $1,200 phone. It's ridiculous. No one needs to have a phone like this. It's not necessary for my life, but I wanted one, right? And so I got one. It cost more than my first car. that might well be a form of idolatry. It might well be evidence that I am greedy, right? And all of you probably have things that you could point to too. All of us can find ourselves in this vice list that's on the screen right now, and none of them are elevated by Paul above any of the other ones. So even if you accept that Paul, which is wrong, even if you accept that Paul is saying homosexuality is bad in this passage, which again is wrong, but even if you say so, then it's not any more wrong than any of these other things. This is simply a list of things that Paul thinks is better not to do. So I'll show you another one, though, another one of these vice lists. So I'm switching slides now. This is 1 Timothy. Here's another vice list, and this one is a little bit more dire, I guess I would say, a little bit more scary. So where before we were dealing with greed and fornication, here we're dealing with murder and slave trading. And here in the middle of it, you see the word again, sodomites, in the NRSV. This is arsenokoites in the Greek. So the first thing to say about this passage from 1 Timothy is that the majority of Bible scholars don't think Paul wrote this. Bible scholars kind of divide Paul's writings into three categories. One category is undisputed, or some people call it authentic Pauline letters. One category is the disputed. These are like Ephesians, Colossians, 2 Thessalonians. And then there's a third category, which is the Pastoral Epistles, which most Bible scholars don't think Paul wrote. So that middle category, you can find people who argue one way or the other. But with the Pastoral Epistles, most people really don't think Paul wrote them. And 1 Timothy is one of those. So the first thing to say about this is not Paul anyway. Whatever we conclude about it, Paul didn't write it. It was written after Paul's lifetime by people who were trying to capitalize on his name. Sorry, I'm reading Corey's comment. I'll come back to that, Corey. They're written in Paul's name in order to kind of advance a position that is that they think was left out. So there's a scholar named Margaret Mitchell who says that these pseudo-Pauline texts, these texts that Paul did not write but were written in his name, that they fix Paul in both senses of the word fix. They fix Paul because they are trying to preserve and maintain Paul's legacy, that is, kind of fix it in the tradition, but also correct it, fix it in that sense of correcting it. And here I think you can see the author of 1 Timothy trying to fix Paul's, thank you, Katie, to fix Paul's legacy on sexuality. And so you see that this vice list is a lot more dire than the first one. I think he's putting arsenokoites in this dire list that in a way that makes it more serious of a problem than it was in Paul's own writing. He's kind of elevating what we would call homosexuality to a worse condition than it is in Paul's own writing. So it's harsher, and it's probably pseudo-Paul trying to correct Paul, authentic Paul, on same-sex activity. So to kind of sum up here, we get Paul wrong on these issues because we misunderstand his context. We assume that he lived in the same world that we live in, which he did not. We mistranslate some of his words because there's no good translation, but we kind of fill those words up with our own agenda about it. The interpreters have their own agenda that gets kind of expressed in these texts, and we misattribute to Paul texts that he did not, in fact, write. So I think all of that together kind of points to a Paul who doesn't condemn homosexuality, certainly, in any way that we would recognize from our own world. And as we'll see at the very end, in some ways, I think we can point to Paul as someone who we can claim on this issue. I want to kind of switch gears, though, and move to the question of misogyny. So we'll kind of pause here for a second. We'll put the brakes on the question of homophobia, and we'll move to the question of misogyny. This is a great little mosaic, by the way, or not a mosaic, a fresco from the 6th century of Paul and Thecla. If you don't know the story of Paul and Thecla, I invite you to go look it up and read it tonight. It's available for free in a number of translations on the web. And it's just a delightful story. Thecla is a woman who hears Paul preaching. She's about to be married. She hears Paul preaching. She thinks, that's the life for me. And she goes off and follows Paul and kind of becomes Paul in some ways. And that really makes her, the guy that she was supposed to marry, angry. It makes her mother angry. It's kind of a really interesting, really interesting story. But it's a nice view into Paul and his relationship with women. I want to do 2 basic things in this part of the webinar to talk about how we've gotten Paul wrong on this question. We need to talk about what Paul's letters say, that is what's in the text of these letters, and we need to talk about what Paul himself did in his own, what his own actions represent. So there's what his letters say, and there's what Paul himself did in his own life and ministry. And we'll see that Paul didn't say many of the things that people think of when they think of his misogyny, and we will see that Paul himself was a remarkably modern supporter of women in ministry. So let's look at some of the text again. Here are a couple of passages from Ephesians and Colossians, which you'll already remember are part of that disputed category where a lot of scholars don't think Paul wrote these. And we could go into the reasons why that's true if you are interested in those. But suffice it to say, most, I would say, kind of mainstream scholars don't think Paul wrote these 2, although you'll see people arguing about it. These are good examples of someone trying to fix Paul's legacy, I think. Again, these are written after Paul's death in his name, and I think they're examples where someone's trying to make Paul say something that he didn't actually say in his undisputed letters, perhaps for their own kind of reasons. They thought that Paul should have said something more like, wives, be subject to your husbands, but he didn't, and so later on they came along and said it for him. So I think we can dismiss these out of hand. This is one of the really kind of common ones that get cited to say that Paul is a misogynist, but Paul didn't write it. It has nothing to do with Paul. One that Paul, that does appear in one of Paul's letters is this passage from 1 Corinthians 14. This is a very notorious one. You can see here on the screen, and in your Bibles, probably, if you have a fairly modern Bible, that this passage is in parentheses, that it is kind of set apart from the rest of the text by parentheses. That's because most Bible scholars, or I would say the great majority of Bible scholars, actually, even fairly conservative ones, don't think that Paul wrote these words. They think Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, but they think that this part of 1 Corinthians, it does not belong to Paul. More about that in a second. But it reads, as you can see, that women should be silent in church, that they shouldn't speak, that if they want to know something, they should go home and ask their husbands. Right? So if you're reading this in 1 Corinthians, you're probably going to come away with the conclusion that Paul was a misogynist. It certainly looks that way from this passage. But Paul didn't write it. It doesn't fit with what Paul said earlier in the very same chapter about broad participation in worship. It doesn't fit with what Paul said earlier in chapter 11, which we'll talk about more in a second, of 1 Corinthians. It doesn't fit with the flow of this section. If you take out these verses, go open your Bible and take out these verses, you'll see that it flows actually better if you take them out. It goes from 33a through 37 much more smoothly than it does here. And perhaps most importantly of all, ancient manuscripts of 1 Corinthians, that is like old papyrus and codices, leather codices of 1 Corinthians, don't include these verses. They're not in there. They appear later on in the tradition. Or if they do appear in 1 Corinthians, sometimes they float around. They appear at different places within that, within the text of 1 Corinthians, which tells us that they were added later on. Another good example of this kind of thing is the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8. That one's one that that kind of moves around in the Gospel of John and even appears in Luke at one point. So that's a good sign that scholars take that this did not originally belong to this text. And that's why you'll see it in modern Bibles in parentheses. So again, this is a very commonly used text to say that women should not have a role in church leadership. But Paul didn't write this. This is something added later on to try to fix Paul's legacy, because Paul was not sufficiently anti-woman for whoever came along and wrote this. Here's a passage from 1 Corinthians that often gets cited. This is a really weird one. I invite you to go and look this one up too. It's in 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16, although I've only given you the first few verses here. This is a strange passage. There's some stuff in there about angels, and it's a lot about hair. It seems like hair is a really big deal in this community and for Paul for whatever reason, probably for reasons we don't understand anymore, but there was a dispute in Corinth about this. And so Paul is intervening in this dispute. And he says, I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the husband is the head of his wife, and that God is the head of Christ. Any man who prays or prophesies with something on his head disgraces his head, but any woman who prays or prophesies with her head unveiled disgraces her head. It is one and the same thing as having her head shaved, which apparently was a bad thing in those times. So what we can see here is, a lot of people use this as a way to say that women shouldn't be involved in church leadership. I think it's actually fascinating as a sign that Paul assumed women were in church leadership. He assumed that women were taking a leadership role, that they were praying and prophesying in communities, and that he thought that was normal. His only concern was how they looked, how they dressed when they did that they ought to look and dress a certain kind of way. That's still obviously a question for both men and women today, how they should be conducting themselves and how they should appear. But Paul just assumes that women are in a leadership position. Robin asked a really good question, which is whether there's an analogy between this idea and other kinds of veiling practices. I think yes, I think there's a historical connection, because a lot of these religious traditions come out of essentially the same place and time. And so cultural practices like veiling were kind of folded into these traditions in different ways. But, probably if you wandered into a first century Christian gathering, a lot of the women would have been veiled, because veiling was a common practice in many parts of the world in antiquity. So that's really what's at play here. Paul assumes that women are taking leadership roles. He just wants to kind of reinforce certain ideas about dress. So, these are things that Paul says about women in his writings. The other thing to remember about Paul's writings is that when we read Paul, we are reading, thank you for that. I have no comment on that, Katie. Katie has talked about hair as sexual organ. I don't know anything about that, but I think we should do a webinar on that sometime, because that sounds fascinating. When we read Paul, we're reading someone else's mail. Paul did not write to us. He did not know that we exist. He had no notion of anyone like us, and he didn't mean this for us. We're reading letters that he wrote to a particular group of people at a particular time and place. So we don't really know what's behind these questions. Maybe there were people in Corinth doing really kind of strange stuff, and he wanted to get a handle on that. It's really difficult for us to know. So when we read his letters, I think there's a limit to how much we can really derive from his letters, because it's all very circumstantial for him. It's all stuff that he is saying to particular people. He probably had individuals in mind when he was saying something like this. But I think we can learn a lot from Paul's actions. This is a long passage. We're not going to read all of this, of course, from Romans 16, one of my favorite chapters in the New Testament, because it's kind of Paul's shout-out chapter. It's where he's giving all his greetings to everyone he knows or thinks he knows in Rome. Yeah, thank you, Corey. So the man is, I think that's right. Paul does say, I'll go back one. Paul does say in 1 Corinthians 11 that the husband's the head of the wife. And I think that's simply one of those cultural biases. That's what everyone thought in those days. That was legally true, that men were in control of women. And so I think he would have taken it as a given. That's different for our time and place. But I do think, Paul was a person of his time, and that's one of the kind of big things I want to get across. But within his time and place, he was often pushing the boundaries. We can come back to that if you want, Corey. So in this chapter in Romans 16, Paul is saying hello to lots of people. And it's a gold mine for scholars because you can start to really get a sense of the networks, who's showing up in these communities, what kind of people show. There's a scholarly word called prosopoia, I think, or prosopography is what it's called, which is the practice of trying to figure out who these folks are based on their names. You can sometimes tell if they were a slave or a free person based on their name, if they were from a particular region of the Mediterranean, which is really, really fascinating stuff. But one thing I want to show you here is that there are lots and lots of women that Paul mentions in this section. And that when he mentions these women, he often does so using really kind of words that denote bravery and action. So he talks about Phoebe. We'll get back to her in a minute. Talks about Prisca. We'll get back to her in a minute. Greet Mary right in the middle of that passage. Who has worked very hard among you. Greet Andronicus and Junia. Junia, we'll talk about in a second. Greet those workers in the Lord, Tryphena and Tryphosa. Greet Persis, who has worked hard in the Lord. So when he mentions women, he usually in this passage talks about how hard they are working, how important they are to the movement, and he really kind of emphasizes that in a way he doesn't always do for the men. So I think you can see here Paul kind of sticking up for the role of these women. I'll pull a few of these little sections out then in this next slide and talk about them in particular. He says about Phoebe that she's a deacon of the church in Cenchrea, which is the port town of Corinth. She has been a benefactor of many and of myself as well. So he's describing here Phoebe as a woman who kind of maybe bankrolls Paul's own work, who makes his work possible. She might be kind of a wealthy benefactor type, or she is a wealthy benefactor type of himself and of many others. He talks about Prisca. Prisca is a woman who appears a number of times in the New Testament, sometimes called Priscilla, sometimes called Prisca, who work with me in Jesus, who risk their necks for my life. And this third woman, Junia, I think is a really fascinating case study because it really gets to the way the Bible, it often comes to us already interpreted. And we're kind of rounding, by the way, the final curve here and heading toward the finish line. So if you have questions that you want to ask, go ahead and start typing those in the question box down below, or finding ways to formulate those, because we'll have a few minutes for questions. But with Junia, I think this is a really great case study. So Junia is a woman's name, and all the ancient manuscripts say Junia. What happens, though, is scribes along the way see the word Junia, and they say, gosh, that's a woman's name. That can't be right, because she's described as prominent among the apostles. Paul is describing this woman as an apostle. And so what they do is they add a letter to her name to make the name Junius, which is a man's name. They add the S at the end. So Junia becomes Junius, Junia becomes a man, and becomes, an apostle in a way that's very kind of normative. Junia gets erased in many, many translations. And I know a guy named Junius, right? This is a name that some Christians name their kids now because, Junius was an apostle. What's interesting about that is that Junia was a very, very common name in antiquity. Lots and lots of evidence of people named Junia. There is nowhere from the entirety of antiquity where there's ever someone named Junius. That's a completely invented name, invented only for the purpose of making Junia into a man. So that kind of shows you how sometimes the process of transmission and translation of the Bible already interprets it for you. It kind of erases Junia before she ever gets to you. But Paul, Paul for himself in Romans 16 is saying, look, here's Junia. She's my relative. She was in prison with me. She's prominent among the apostles. And she was in Christ before I was, right? That's a good question, Robin. Would that be a transgender apostle? I think you should write a paper on that and see how that argument plays out. That's an interesting question. A misgendered, yeah, I think that's probably a good way to put it, Corey. Misgendered apostle. There are other examples of this in Paul's letters that I won't kind of go into. There's Chloe in 1 Corinthians 1:11. She seems to be an important person who, feeds information to Paul. She has a network. Perhaps she is a merchant of some kind, and he hears about, yeah, thank you, Robin. Paul hears about stuff going on in Corinth via Chloe. There's a 2nd century document that I already kind of talked about, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, which describes Paul's relationship with this woman who's kind of a protege of his. She's kind of a female Paul. So I think there's lots of evidence that Paul, early on in the Christian tradition, was a big supporter of women. And Chloe, Jim, is in 1 Corinthians 1:11. So he says something, I don't have it in front of me, but he says something like, I've heard from Chloe's people that there's stuff going on in Corinth. And it's lots of stuff that's disturbing to Paul. But the point is that Chloe is the one who's sort of passing on this information. All right, so to kind of wrap up, and then we'll get to some of these questions because I'm starting to see these pouring in. We've gotten Paul wrong on women in a few different ways. Paul did not write the most misogynistic part of his letters, and I'll address the question that Amy asked right here. The reason, so there's a few reasons scholars don't think that that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians 14:33b through 36. One is that, yeah, it contradicts other stuff Paul says, but the main reason actually is that it doesn't appear in ancient manuscripts. So ancient manuscripts often don't have those verses, or they appear somewhere else, which is a good sign that someone had scribbled them into the margins or something. Some later scribe had added that in. So that's why people think that. So Paul did not write the most misogynistic or the most anti-woman parts of his letters, including stuff from Ephesians, Colossians, and that section of 1 Corinthians. So we've gotten Paul wrong that way. We've gotten Paul wrong because some of his direct comments about women in church from 1 Corinthians 11 assume that women are praying and prophesying and worship. They are leading worship, and he's simply worried about how they look while they're doing that. But Paul assumes women's leadership. And finally, I think we've gotten Paul wrong on women because his actions, as we see in Romans 16, his sort of social networks and his public endorsements of women show that he assumed their leadership, he valued their leadership, and he boosted them as ministry colleagues. He's really writing recommendations for them in Romans 16 as a way to kind of further them. And, there's no hint in Romans 16 that he thinks there should be limits on this. He simply knows that these women are important and valuable, and he says so in a public kind of way. So I want to close with one slide. Someone already made reference to this earlier. Sometimes I think this verse is overdone as kind of an interpretive key for progressive Christians, but I think it's perfect in this case, and that is Galatians 3:28. This also appears, by the way, in a different form in a couple of different places in the New Testament, including Colossians. But it says, there is no longer Jew or Greek, there is no longer slave or free, there is no longer male or female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. Here I think we see what was a very common, very pervasive idea in Paul's communities, that Paul and his communities would have taken this as a given, that this is the kind of thing that Christianity is based on, that in Jesus, in baptism, in belonging to this community, all these kind of differences are erased. Now, Paul doesn't say in here, in Christ there is no longer gay or straight, but I absolutely think that if he lived in 2018, he would have said that. and a number of other things like that as well, because he is really arguing that any distinctions among human beings are meaningless in light of the event of Jesus. He thinks Jesus levels all the things that we place between us as ways to distinguish among ourselves. So I think that is actually a really great place to end on. That this is a principle. A lot of people, by the way, think that this little thing is a saying that people use as a very primitive baptismal creed, that you come up out of the water of baptism, and this is what the whole congregation says to you. Look, there's no longer Jew or Greek. There's no longer slave or free. There's no longer male or female. You are all one in Christ Jesus. And I think that is the truest look at Paul that we can have. So I think we have a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes for questions. One of the questions that I saw came from Amy, which is, will we have access to a recording of this webinar and or this presentation? And the answer to that is yes, we will. Katie with Disciple Seminary Foundation will make this available in ways that she will type about, I'm sure, in the sidebar there. But there'll be ways for you to access it and use it if you want to. Are there other kinds of questions or other things people want to add, or I didn't hit everything, so maybe people want to add something that they think of. Are there any other proposed translations of those hapax legomena words? Megan asked. That's a good question. I think that would be a good question to answer after I've looked at a dictionary for a long time. My own sense is that Paul does probably mean something with an economic valence. I think he probably is referring to something exploitative like prostitution rather than a consensual mutual relationship. And I think he also assumes power differentials, like a slave master kind of thing, where the master is abusing someone. So I think translations that somehow capture that, violence, as Jim puts it, I think translations that capture the fact that these are exploitative or violent relationships would be a good one. But that's not what modern translations typically do. They typically just reproduce kind of Christian bias about this. My email address, if people want to email me directly, is ecsmith@iliff.edu, ILIFF, or you can email me at esmith@dsf.edu. And we can always chat further that way. And and Katie has given hers there. And Katie, this is something, if we had better luck with technology here, we would have kind of thrown it to Katie at this point, but I'll do the pitch for her, which is, this is something that DSF is exploring, these kind of webinars. So if you have ideas for things that would be a good future learning opportunity for this kind of webinar, if you have something you want to know more about, or that your congregation would like to know more about, that you would like to see someone come in and talk about, please send this over to kvalentine@dsf.edu and kind of give some suggestions, because we're very open to this. We're very interested in making this happen. We have a webinar coming up on December 3rd with Richard Voles, who is a great human being. And he teaches homiletics somewhere in Virginia. I've forgotten where. And he's going to be talking about the Blue Christmas, meaningful worship in the face of reproductive loss. Thank you, Jose. See you later. Richmond Theological. Thank you. And so Megan, that's a good question. This will be the last question, I think, because we're kind of running out of time, and I know folks need to go. Modernity versus antiquity. And how is this relevant to someone who says modernity as a whole is bad and that we've lost our way? That's a great question. I think even people who think modernity is bad live in modernity. They, live by the kind of categories of modernity. They kind of rely on the assumptions that we all kind of share. So even if you think this is a bad kind of way to organize the world, it's still the way we live in the world. And I don't know that many of us would like to return to that ancient world, which for all of the romance we put onto it was a fairly terrible place to be, even for people with a lot of privilege. You know, people, the lifespan, the average life expectancy was something like 35 years. People died of disease and in violence all the time. You know, it was not a great place. So I think even those who would romanticize antiquity would not want to have lived there. And I think, you know, science and culture and our society has advanced in a way that makes our world preferable. So that's maybe not a really satisfying answer. As Katie says, we'll have maybe time for that in the short course, which I would love to have some of you sign up for. So, all right, I think that's probably it for now. I don't, yeah, I see the button to stop the broadcast. So I'm going to stop the broadcast here. And thank you all for attending. And I look forward to interacting with you in other kinds of ways. And I look forward to seeing you on future webinars with the Disciple Seminary Foundation. Thanks so much for being here. Take care.